good sign, and plough ahead. I'm just going to introduce the organisation that I work for, the Royal Society of Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce. We are based in London, but we have a global fellowship of 30,000 fellows. We believe in creating a world where everyone is able to participate in creating a better future. And we see our purpose and mission as bringing people together with ideas to resolve the big challenges of our time. And we have a US subsidiary, but as I say, we have a global presence as well. And we've been engaged in discussions and debates about the future of work and economic insecurity for decades, if not generations. But it's a particular focus of our work currently. We combine research with policy thinking, intersecting with design and innovation, thinking about social change and social movements, and how we can build coalitions of insight that can gather momentum behind change. And we apply something we call the living change model, which is, if you like, is a way of responding to complex challenges in a complex world, where we try to spot possibilities for change. We try to create good ideas, good arguments, and good thinking about how they might be designed into policy and systemic change, and then bringing and gathering conversation around it. We have our own ideas platform, which is global in scope as well. As I say, we've focused on the future of work and economic security for the last few years. We believe that the future of work should be good work for all, and that's work that provides a degree of security, that doesn't harm well-being, that enables sort of individual growth, that supports freedom of growth and expression and pursuit of opportunity, and cultivates a sense of belonging and a sense of identity. So it's about sort of personal involvement and connection, feeling included, as much as having economic security. We've done a lot of work on the nature of modern economic insecurity, and I'll go into some of our research later on to illustrate the conversation. We are interested in interesting and innovative new ideas, such as universal basic income. We've been a leading voice advocating for experimentation with universal basic income and thinking about how it might be applied in practice. We think the field of conversation around the types of responses that are necessary should be widened, and that's one of the responses that might be interesting to explore. Very briefly, our model of change is here. I won't go into too much detail about the diagram, but it shows that we think about change in a comprehensive and long-term way. We think about possibilities for change. We think about how we can act on change and how we can grow communities around change, as well as understanding the context through core and rigorous research and policy thinking. So that's us. And it'd be great to have the opportunity to introduce ourselves to this conversation. Now, this presentation is seeking to make a case that economic security should be what I've described as a mega challenge. And just to give a bit of context on what I mean by mega challenge, I'll go into a bit more detail later on. But I mean a challenge of the order of climate change, of spread of automation and technology, of widespread democratic challenges that societies are facing. One of the areas of focus that, if as a global community and a series of national communities, we can really respond effectively together, as well as in our local environments, we can improve the state of life and well-being on this planet. So that's what I mean by a mega challenge. I mean it's sort of transcendent in terms of something we need to focus on in order to achieve radical change over the next few years. I'm going to start off with a quote, not from a philosopher, although they may be a philosopher, I don't know. I met them in a town called, or an area called Fife in Scotland, when we were doing some deep citizen engagement around the experience of economic insecurity, and thinking about the welfare system and the world of work and how people are experiencing it. Fife's an area of Scotland that has a mix of industrial areas, post-industrial areas, former mining communities, new towns. Commuter towns is very near to the Scottish city of Edinburgh. So it's an interesting geographical mix. It has an interesting spread of economic geography and a range of experiences around security. And I thought this quote was particularly apposite. It was a citizen of Fife. They just simply said, the system fatigues people in every way, physically, mentally, and financially. And what they meant by the system, I think, was two things. One, the system of the world of work and the experience of work, and how it had become more precarious and insecure over time, even though unemployment rates have gone up, or indeed at record levels. But it's also the experience of public systems, the social security systems, and so on. And time again, we've got testimony of the ways in which experience of actually trying to get the thing that should help you to feel more secure actually generated a greater sense of anxiety and mental ill health and absence of well-being. So people are constantly trying to wrestle with systems, and they're struggling increasingly. That's our sort of sense. And it's the thing about economic security, it's a very sort of real and tangible way in which people are experiencing their engagement with the wider world. So for us, economic security defines a degree of confidence that a person can have in maintaining a decent quality of life now and in the future, given their economic and financial circumstances. It has a number of composite elements. It's based on their past and current experience. There's a subjective element to economic insecurity. It's not simply a metric, although metrics are critical to understanding it. So it's things like, do I have enough to maintain a decent standard of living given my asset base in the event of some sort of shock? It might be a shock to health, well-being, to your state of work, to your community, a shift in comparative advantage. Do I have enough to navigate? It has a subjective element. But underneath it, there is an objective characteristic to economic insecurity. And it's about your access to assets, wealth, resources, income on a secure basis over time. Time matters. It embeds within it a notion of perceived risk, which is important. And of course, there is a sort of personality basis to perceived risk as well. And this is why all these things together have to work alongside one another. Some have a greater sense of loss aversion than others, but in the main, people are pretty good at perceiving when they are at risk of potential loss or volatility, and volatility matters as much as sort of the deep experience of a distressed economic situation, for example. And finally, at the other end of the spectrum, to sort of loss aversion, there is optimism bias. You have to understand some of the objective data because there's hidden risks. Time and time again, we experience in our research work, whether it's qualitative survey work or quantitative research work, people saying that they feel fairly secure, that they're employed and so on. But then you look at the actual circumstances that underpin that, their level of qualifications, the type of housing that they're in, their access to savings, for example. There's hidden risks that they aren't properly understanding or exploring or taking into account. So there's a hidden element. So economic insecurity works across all these dimensions. About your personal experience, there's an objective element to it. It's about perception, but there's also this hidden element of risk. Here's just some of our survey data, which I think probably exhibits some of those elements quite clearly. So in terms of perceived risk, 40% are not confident they will maintain a decent quality of life in the next 10 years. These are UK surveys, and I apologise for the parochial nature of a lot of the data in this presentation, but I hope you'll take it as an example of the experience of economic security in an advanced industrial society, and we'll try and draw wider lessons and present a different picture as we go along. So 40% are not qualified, they can maintain a decent quality of life in 10 years. 78% believe workers face more uncertainty and anxiety. Of course, that's about the context of the general state of work and perceptions of the risks that others face. 55% believe family finances will become more insecure in the future. And 41% have access to savings of less than £500, which I guess is about $600 to $650, something of that order. This is a very low amount of accessible savings if you were to face sudden economic insecurity. 58% think government should be doing more. So across a range of metrics, we're seeing these perceptions of risk, felt experience of risk, and we're seeing some of that sort of hidden risk, if you like, when you look at assets and savings, all of which I think coming together makes economic security one of the challenges of our time. Why does it matter? Well, it's prevalent, and the Jacob Hacker data here is critical in understanding volatility. And over a 15-year period, more than 7% of low-paid experienced an instance of 25% income loss. And the OECD have calculated that a third of people are at risk of falling into poverty. So it's prevalent, it's significant. In industrial societies, it's significant, and in lower-income countries, it's significant as well. Going back to the quote from that resident of 5, it's relatable. People feel a sense of insecurity amongst individuals and communities. It does have this geographical component. It's influenced by where you live, but you can feel a sense of insecurity. It's internalized. You feel deeply poverty, but if you're not in acute poverty, you may not feel that sense of poverty. You may feel it's something that affects other people. And that's often what we get in our conversations that we do in communities, by the way. They think that poverty is something that affects other people. Insecurity is something that affects them. So because it's relatable, it has this key felt sense of something that is important, that can be damaging, and might need to be addressed. It's consequential for evidence, for individuals, evidence around impact on aversion to risk, trying things new out, the impacts on anxiety, mental health, substance abuse, pain, a feeling of stuckness. And this is the disease despair analysis, obviously related to self-medication in different ways, with the harmful effects on physical and mental health that flow out of that. You could be overloaded by a sense of anxiety and risk. This is the sort of the bandwidth overload analysis. So it is highly consequential, it's damaging. And finally, at a societal level, it creates blockages. This fear of others creates a sort of lack of trust, which can lead to political fear and anxiety, can lead people going into the wormhole of all sorts of different political perspectives that may or may not be grounded in reality, but can lead to a very sort of divisive society that will then struggle to resolve major challenges such as climate change. So that's the knock-on effect, if you like. So it undermines society's ability to resolve the collective challenges it faces. So for those reasons, and in the original comments and introductory comments, Dan, I mentioned the intersection with poverty and inequality, which are absolutely critical here, but insecurity as a felt sense, the prevalence, the relatability, the consequentiality, and the impediments to society forming and resolving its collective challenges means that this matters. And that's why I think it's a mega challenge. And of course, economic insecurity is experienced differently depending on society, its institutions, its history. It is, so the challenge is different in each setting, and I'll come back to that as to what this might mean from a sort of policy framework perspective. There isn't a sort of general suite of a perfect response to economic insecurity. Each society has to face it in different ways, given its own trajectories and institutional structures and so on. But it's important that each society does think about where they are on the map to greater security. And it's not something that's resolved. It's either you have more or less, and it's better to have less up to a certain point, one might argue. But there is a need for a shared global policy understanding, global narrative and dialogue understanding, the need for local innovation and major institutional reform, and wider participation in resolving these challenges. So I'll come back to some of that, what that might mean in practice a bit further down the line. I want to introduce you to some of the thinking that we've been doing around where some of the risks are. And again, a lot of this is focused on advanced industrial societies, although there are lessons and some insights from elsewhere as well. I want to introduce you to an idea which we describe as the security trap, and how increased risk, accelerating change, and increased polarization of experience play into this notion of the security trap. So this is the security trap. This is not a sort of trilemma or a trade-off, but there are trade-offs within it and tensions within it. And the idea behind the security trap is, depending on your relationship with economic systems, such as the world of work, housing, finance, you will face a series of tensions and intensity of deficits in these three domains. One, fairly obviously, is income, assets, outgoings. But secondly is about care, responsibilities, and private lives. When you're in a more difficult relationship with economic structures, economic systems, that could be expected to have impacts on your care responsibilities and your quality of individual and family life. And then another domain is about physical and mental health and well-being. So again, if you're in a difficult relationship with economic systems, it's not just about that you're impoverished, it's about the nature of the work that you do, and we'll come on to that. Then you will find it more difficult to balance in an optimal way income, care, and your responsibilities in your private life and your physical and mental health. And this slide kind of just covers the ground that we've done. Other than I would emphasize that a critical factor here is that institutions can alleviate the level of distress. Good work regulation, strong social insurance, unconditional incomes of different types, guaranteed incomes, basic incomes, good housing regulation and supply and affordability, availability of access to education, skills, and access to health and care are all things which can alleviate the intensity of the feelings of these tensions and states of distress between those three elements. So the security trap, if you like, is ending up into a situation where you're facing distress in all three of those domains. If you're feeling a sense of moderate to high insecurity, you might find that you're experiencing distress in one, but others might be in a reasonable situation. But then if you try to change the situation, then one could be more distressed and one could be alleviated. And it's having to face those choices, right? These choices and dilemmas, and not having the agency to navigate your material needs allied to your home care responsibilities and your health, mental and physical. So we've been doing some work, something called the RSA Economic Security Observatory, and what we've been doing is we've been looking at key workers, essential workers, in the course of the pandemic to see what their experience has been along these three dimensions of income, assets, care, responsibilities, health, mental and physical. Now, this is a particular group of workers. They tend to be more economically, or in terms of job security, more secure than the population average, because they're in things like care and health and so on. So obviously they're societally necessary. They're probably largely funded by the public sector. So they have sort of relative job security. But because of the nature of their work and because of the situation they've been placed in, actually, over the course of the past year in the context of pandemic, they've been experiencing distress on those other dimensions within the security trap, if you like. So in November, we asked this group of essential workers, this is survey data, whether they feel likely that they'll burn out this winter. And almost half of the key or essential workers said that they feared that they would. Healthcare staff, National Health Service staff, 63%. We took that survey today, by the way, with the hospitals in the UK basically full. I'd imagine the number is even greater than that. 63 is terrifying enough, but it will be even higher. And then you can see the others, care workers, schools and nursery staff, and so on. And then looking back, percent of key workers have felt a larger significant risk of catching coronavirus, the health question at work. NHS staff, 56% felt they're at risk of catching coronavirus at work. And then we look on the table on the bottom right. 70 key workers have found it more difficult to maintain their mental health as a result of coronavirus. 67% of healthcare staff said they have been struggling to maintain their mental health over the past year. Now, you might just say, well, this is just because of the pandemic and it's intense. And yes, and the point about pandemics is that they reveal tensions and they accentuate tensions in people's lives. But it's because of the relationship that they have with particular types of work, you start to see these tensions and interplay between these different factors. And we would argue that actually it is at the core of this is an economic relationship to the world of work, which has consequences for your health and your private life. And in this particular group of workers, this is shown most acutely. And if you were to run this survey anywhere that has experienced intensity of COVID, the COVID pandemic, I'm sure you get some similar responses. The UK is a pretty extreme example. Alongside this, of course, we've been experiencing what is probably an acceleration of technological change. I should say that we're kind of skeptical in the main of the whole sort of job obsolescence, the robots are going to take over the world style narrative. But that doesn't mean that technology doesn't have impacts on particular groups of workers, particular groups of workers in particular places, and that doesn't create a major societal challenge. And we think it does. And actually, we think that the technological change that we see in society, we've probably seen 5 years acceleration in 5 months. So we did see 5 years acceleration in 5 months in 2020 as new business models came to the fore, as people shifted some of their behaviours online, and that behaviour shift was massive. Online retail, for example, in the UK has increased from 20 to 30% of the total in a matter of months. So we're seeing an acceleration of change, and of course acceleration means that certain groups of workers are empowered over others, if you're in retail, for example, on a high street or main street, then your job has been in severe jeopardy, and that might be some of it may be a permanent loss, and some of it may be a sign of things come over the next few years. The impacts are polarized. We'll come on to some of the data here, but the pace of transition has been unmanageable. The type of shift that we've seen in the last year, you'd want to have, from a policy perspective, the opportunity to manage that from an individual and place perspective over a 5-6 year period. But the pace has been ferocious, and I think this has obviously emphasized the risks in acute form that certain groups of workers have been facing. We've done a sort of bit of analysis on the intersection of automation and the experience of COVID, and what we find is we broke down the UK workforce into sectors and a series of characteristics which we segmented. The areas that have been at high risk of COVID and high risk of automation is probably precarious work, and we have seen this in the categories that you see before. So just to explain this very quickly, those at high risk of automation, which is categories 1 and 3, you see on that table beneath all workers, their average hourly earnings were £4 an hour less than the average. And for those at risk of pandemic and automation, those not at risk of pandemic but are at risk of automation, it might be sort of warehouse workers or something like that, which are automatable, if you like. Work is automatable. Actually, they earn in the main about £5 less per hour. So it's a low paid that are most at risk. On the gender front, actually, men are more at risk on the intersection of COVID and automation. It's about balanced on automation alone, and it's workers under 30 who are most at risk. Now, it might be that they're in positions at the moment that are at risk, and their career pathway will take them into a different direction, but equally an experience of economic distress, unemployment, insecurity early part of your career can have lasting effects. So obviously, it's a group that we want to have some close public policy focus upon. Workers with degrees obviously are in a better position overall. But what it shows is that the particularities of the impact as well. So it's not so much the aggregates that matter, it's the particulars in terms of which people, what are their characteristics, how vulnerable are they, what does this mean for particular places, and those are the interesting questions, if you like. I think the last year has shown some potentially worrying signals. This is the European-wide data. We haven't published this data yet, so it hasn't been for full review, but I thought it was worth sharing anyway. And what it generally shows is the sectors that are losing employment are also the ones in the highest risk of automation segments. Probably expect that, but it's important to keep that in mind. But it also shows that there is a, across Europe at least, there is a geographical component to this, with the Northern European countries more likely to be creating jobs less at risk of automation than the Southern European countries, and that might describe some potential geographical risk going forward. So in terms of understanding where we're at this point around polarization, i.e. Impacts on particular workers and particular risks, and the conversation about economic insecurity is a conversation about risk as much as anything else. On acceleration, as automation affects these particular groups of workers because of the structure of work, how it's composed, the skill sets and skills biases within that is critical, and the overall sort of risk profile. We see in higher income countries, the uneven impact of automation, institutional sluggishness or drift, I think, as Jacob Hacker calls it, unbundling of social contracts over a period of time, less support available from trade union membership, but also welfare states becoming more targeted and less universal over time. And then lower and lower middle income countries, the risks are slightly different. Premature deindustrialization in Danny Roderick's phrase, not sufficient bundling or institutional development, leapfrogging over sectors that might have some more secure work for a period of time, such as was enjoyed by industrial nations, manufacturing sectors, and then this sort of large pool of informal workers and productivity challenges. So the point to emphasize here is economic insecurity is a global challenge that can only be understood in context. So you need to understand the particular challenges to have any sort of realistic and substantive response. So finally, I just want to sort of go through how we might respond to this. I'm slightly over time, but I'll unless Jonathan signals me away, I'll sort of just give some quick thoughts about what this means in practice as a response. It is about policy, but not policy alone. And I was thinking about this in a UN context, and this is why the work that's being done is so important. I think we need a stronger grand narrative around economic security and why it matters, and its impacts and the risks associated with it. And I think that global conversation and that global narrative is needed. Obviously we have a vibrant and crucial and epochal conversation around climate emergency. We need something even bigger than we have currently around economic insecurity as a force driving outcomes for individuals and communities. We need to understand it in context for the reasons that hopefully have been clear from the data slide. There needs to be a civil society mobilisation around this, and the reason for this mainly is because without this wider mobilisation, you might not find the right policies, the right solutions, the creativity to come up with answers to some other challenges, but you may not be able to sustain a response to a mega challenge without a widespread civil society mobilisation, as well as a process of policy development, alongside civic and social innovation, including tools of deliberative democracy, but innovations that can help workers develop, have voice, access more secure finance, training skills, and so on. And finally, policy and institutional development, underpinning all that and reinforced by it itself. So this should really be a circular motion rather than a linear one in many respects. On the narrative front, I think, as I was saying, I think the UN has an enormous role to play here in articulating the why it matters, what the consequences are, how we might go about addressing some of these challenges, how we might approach the challenge. Other international bodies similarly. I think COVID is a window of opportunity, because I think the frayed nature of many social contracts and social security systems and legal systems has been demonstrated. I think we need some diagnostic tools so each society can understand where its institutions are. What does that mean in the field of housing, regulation and competition and antitrust? What are our environmental policies? How do they play in and around economic security and insecurity? What does our skill systems look like? I think what could be most helpful is some ways of countries sort of assessing where they are on the journey that can create a dynamic for response. Understanding the impacts of not cutting climate emissions on global warming is a powerful mobilizing tool. Economic insecurity doesn't lend itself to such simple metrics, but actually having a map about where different countries are and how they might develop or where their risks are could be incredibly helpful. And then you obviously have to apply that in particular settings. I pose the question, could the notion of security trap help understanding, because of these trade-offs and tensions and intensities? I think it might be able to. From a civil society perspective, it's not an original observation to look at history and see where social change has been achieved and secured and sustained has been where there's been a strong civil society mobilization, media, community organizing, policy development, building of new organizations and associations and so on. This will be critical in economic insecurity setting, and voice will be critical if we are to get anywhere. Some of the voices, such as I reflected back to from Fife, I think are incredibly powerful as motivating elements of how we can properly respond to economic insecurity. And then I think that in the innovation space, we do need to find ways of capturing voice, widening participation, helping us hear the challenges and helping us understand how current institutions aren't doing their job and think about how they might do their job better. There needs to be a support for there's a huge sort of upsurge of social and civic innovation around union organisation, providing microcredit, access to skills, job search tools, mentoring, coaching, and so on. The risk is all these innovations just sort of fade away and decay without having really any sort of scale or system-wide impact. So some encouragement for how you can create a system that can enable innovations to cluster and scale in meaningful ways. That's incumbent upon trust, foundations, governments, obviously, as well as local authority and institutions. And finally, policy last, not last, but very much in context. It can't be a series of one-size-fits-all response. It has to be linked to civil society and voice and innovation. There's a critical role for international bodies in helping us understand how some places are navigating better than others and why they've done certain things and what impacts that they have, and also to keep us focused on the importance of economic insecurity. So here's the final slide. I think in recent years, we now can see the impacts of economic security on individuals and communities. We can see how it creates anxieties over status, diminishes trust in others and institutions, and creates fertile ground for societal divisions, which impede our ability to resolve collective significant challenges. If we are to respond to these challenges, we have to have a response to economic insecurity. As part of that response, for example, to the climate emergency will struggle more to be sustained without greater economic security underpinning it. Context matter, but if we are to respond in highly diverse and innovative ways, we can start to lean in to diminishing the risk society as described by Ulrich Beck. For all these reasons, I think we're facing a mega challenge. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Anthony. I mean, very interesting presentation and really rich ideas. Stimulated a lot of questions, as you can see in the question and answer. So we'll dive right in. We have about 18 minutes left, and maybe we can run over a couple of minutes if Anthony is willing. So I'll start off. There's a first question about the role of civil society in meeting climate change challenges. Obviously, you've mentioned that a little bit, but carry on.
Yeah. I think what's in, I mean, it's critical, obviously, you can gather from what I said in the presentation. I think what's kind of interesting is increasingly I see sort of civil society in its response to the climate emergency drawing together with questions around economic insecurity, probably for the reasons that I've discussed. There is a social justice element of this. The historical polluters have been in the industrialized north, and far less so by a mega factor in the global south. And so, you know, if we are to have a comprehensive global response, for example, international development has to factor in how economic insecurity intersects with the climate emergency, but domestically it matters too, and increasingly around areas such as the Green New Deal conversation is an interesting one. Because it combines concern with the climate situation and wider impacts on the environment, with access to good and different work and support for baseline security and communities as they have to transition, a just transition in the phrase, and so on. So I think actually already these things are starting to come together. I think, if you like, the economic insecurity part of the movement can be dialed up a bit, and it can be drawn even closer together.
Great. So it looks like there's another question from the same participant. So if that's okay, I'll move on to include some other questions from other people as well. So from another attendee, there's a question about your thoughts on negative income tax for improving economic security as opposed to a universal basic income.
Yeah. I mean, technically they're very similar, and if you were to ask me, it's not going to be politically possible to introduce a universal basic income. Should we look at a negative income tax instead? Then pragmatically, I'd say yes. I think the experience of them is slightly different though, and I think it goes back to the point I was making about loss aversion. If you take something away from people, there is a greater sense of loss than if you just give people something and enable them to build an income on top of it. So the latter structure, if you like, is the universal basic income, which I think ultimately engenders, I think it's more transparent than universal basic income, and I think it's likely to engender a greater sense of trust. The Finnish trials into basic income, by the way, one of the big findings is that they improved trust between citizens and each other, and between citizens and public institutions. And I think there's something around that sort of, if you like, that element of having that thing which is yours as of right, which can't be taken away, is indivisible, and then you build on top of that, which I think probably creates a greater psychological sense of security. But I think we need more experimental data to understand how people actually experience the difference between them, and technically they're not worlds apart.
Sure, great. So there's another question here. We know the language we use is important for how we understand issues in this context. Which provides the most analytical advantage in terms of prioritizing action? Economic inequality or economic insecurity? Social justice or economic insecurity? The question here about the terms that we use.
This is a really good question. The conclusion I came to some time ago, and again, some of this is playing this into conversation with people who are experiencing economic insecurity in some respect and so on, is that you shouldn't try and play off one way of describing economic distress against another. And I'm trying not to have my cake and eat it in my answer. I think people actually have a different frame of, I think the framing point is absolutely right. But they have a different relationship to the different frames, and both matter. Right? So inequality they see as a societal level injustice. And they see manifestations of that injustice, if you like, wealth being concentrated and pooled and so on. Well, people like them or people they know and their friends and family are struggling to make ends meet and fear for their future. So I think if you like, if you ask people to describe fairness on a societal level, which matters, concepts such as inequality, I think are critically important. Economic insecurity, I think, is a more personal thing, and it's more visceral in many respects. It is, of course, they are related and deeply related, although not the same. But an unequal society is one in which people are more likely, excuse me, in general, to experience insecurity. Sorry, I've been talking for quite some time. Yeah. So you can't dissect the two, but I think economic insecurity is going to be a powerful public and political mobilizer, in a way that inequality is to a certain extent. But because of that personal and connected and relatable element to it, insecurity is critical. You can describe it, you can feel it, you can live it, you can see it. So I think if I was in a political or civil society environment, I would of course make reference to inequality, but I would, in terms of the real sort of to drive the energy behind change in the conversation, I probably lean slightly more heavily on economic insecurity.
Great, very interesting. So another question, I'm just running through them, get through as many as we can. Since insecurity goes to your last point, is relatable among individuals and communities, is it a potent force for politicians to tap in? Have you found any evidence to suggest it improves support for redistribution and government support or populism and an anti-establishment mentality?
The research of Philip Wren is interesting on this, and I have no reason to question it. And almost any pollster that you speak to or any poll that you look at will come to the conclusion that actually the cause of the time is security, right? People are feeling a sense of fragility and vulnerability. So the political leaders, the community leaders that can articulate a vision of how to respond to that vulnerability and sense of not having enough control over your own life and destiny are the ones that are going to get the ear of more people. Now, this actually plays out in two ways. One, it plays out in the more if like economic justice direction, where people want greater redistribution. They want more investment in their community. They want access to more secure income and better jobs. So that's more of a sort of, if you like, a progressive left style dialogue, and I'm not limiting its degrees rather than black and white distinctions. But it also plays into a status anxiety, which is around fear of others, a sense that there is a cultural sense of loss or unfairness in society, that your position is being threatened. That might be your position in a social hierarchy. It might be the position of your locality connected to the core of economic and political power, for example. So peripheral towns, villages, regions will feel this sense of if you like, social and cultural injustice as much as economic injustice. So it plays in two ways. The former branch, the economic justice branch, I think has greater possibilities to respond directly to the challenge of economic insecurity. The status anxiety branch, I think, is going, not saying it can't, but is going to struggle to do so. And I think that has to be a critical analytical point. That what's the route to resolving the actual crux of the challenge? Well, it's institutions of greater inclusivity rather than greater division.
Sure. So another question here, should gig work be banned to improve economic insecurity? You're either an independent contractor or an employer with associated rights and protections. Many people now fall into a grey area where they have unstable earnings and very little social protection.
It should be regulated very differently. There was an interesting piece actually thrown up in the Financial Times this morning touching on precisely this issue, and it was talking about President Biden's commitment to a $15 minimum wage, federal minimum wage. And it was making the point, well, yes, fine. And by the way, the criticism that's going to destroy employment is not sustained by the evidence base particularly, but working conditions matter as well, you know, and it's about the power relationship between the worker and the employer or the commissioner or the purchaser, depending on the environment that you're in. So I don't think you don't want to get into the field of outlawing areas of work, because for some people, gig work, actually good quality gig work, you know, works for them. They want to have flexible work. It fits around their personal needs better. It gives them access to earning something alongside, for example, care responsibilities. So I don't think you want to, unless work is downright dangerous, and if it was downright dangerous and sort of destructive of mental health in very obvious and established ways, that's a different matter. But you don't want to get into the territory of banning work. You want to create economic opportunities or the freedom for people to work in ways which suit them, but you want to make sure those are good quality ways. So you want to create a regulatory environment where you know, the worker is free to choose when they work and when they don't. So the flexibility is on the worker side rather than the platform side, for example. And those are the ways in which I would address it. It would be for the regulatory response, and then from a civil society perspective, it's making sure, I know a whole series of organisations that do this, that have been doing this, organise.org, for example, that pull together worker voice in a very effective way, even though they're workers that are spread geographically disparately and don't come into contact with one another because they might be driving taxis or mopeds or whatever it might be. So there's a civil society response and a strong regulatory response underpinned by minimum wages rather than banning unless there are safety issues.
Right.
Oh, by the way, just on that, sorry, just one more thought. Basic income, of course, gives people better scope to say no to economic work that isn't good quality.
Right. So a comment here to say that economic insecurity, as you've mentioned, I think, Anthony, draws in several subjects: educational, but basic infrastructure, housing, information. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Question here again. In thinking about the future of work and economic insecurity, work can be also seen as including unpaid work within the family, and sharing within the family is the first line of defense against economic shocks. So changes in the size and social roles of families are crucial to changes in economic insecurity. So the question is, do we have a larger frame of analysis than the market for paid labour?
That's such a good point, and it's absolutely correct, of course. And it goes into that point I was making about the security trap. Actually, those you know, responsibilities that, and particularly affects women, of course, and that has to be absolutely be clear and established. It shouldn't be that way, but it is that way. That we need to think about the range of people's responsibilities. And I think probably one of the big problems of the type of policy discussion that we've been having for the last sort of 15, 20 years or so, it's the objectives have become incredibly narrow, and it's just been about increasing employment to a greater or lesser extent, and increasing skills or qualifications alongside, and then the private stuff is kind of seen as private, right? And not really the place for policy to be too concerned about that. Well, I think nothing could be further from the truth. That unless people are able to balance what they feel the need to do, what they have to do in their private lives, their caring lives, alongside paid and waged work in a way that safeguards their mental and physical health, unless we think about the whole picture of that, we're missing the fundamental things that are going to be affecting and potentially distressing people. So I think that the conversation around economic security actually has to be a bigger and richer conversation around, you know, the power structures that exist within society as it relates not just to the economy, but the way we live our lives, and thinking about how policy, legal, regulatory, fiscal supports can be put in place in a way that can alleviate some of those challenges in the context of a wider conversation around what equality, particularly between the genders, should be in the future.
Great. So we've got a couple more minutes, so I'll continue this barrage of very difficult and very good questions from our attendees. Yeah. So a question here. Thank you for a very interesting presentation, Anthony. My question is, how can we bring about change to tackle economic insecurity among civil society, given social justice issues like poverty are so widely challenged by governments as an individual problem? How can we change the script?
That's a big question. Well, let's learn from some of the successful examples. Right. I referenced the sort of the living wage conversation. There's been a living wage campaign in the UK, $15 in the US and beyond. And it seems to me what has been successful around that campaign is that they have been fueled with the authentic voice of those who have been most impacted by low wages and insecure work. That it's had a mobilization element, but it's also had an innovation element. So living wage has been parts of it about putting pressure on employers to pay a living wage rather than just look for the policy solution. The campaign's built allies, you know, amongst churches, trade unions, communities. They saw change as with a very sort of simple message, but they saw change as comprehensive and all-encompassing. They've achieved policy objectives and goals. A number of cities and states have endorsed a 15 or implemented a $15 minimum wage. UK level, there has been a living wage of sorts. You can come across not the authentic living wage, but a living wage of sorts. So I think there's lessons in that. And there's lessons in the climate emergency, just transition movement as well. And there's lessons in history. And the lessons you keep on coming back to is that there needs to be, you know, clarity of purpose, widespread civic innovation, engagement, movement building, and over time it starts to shift. And when you face a situation where you're looking for system level responses and big transitions, and those moments do come periodically, the experimentation has been done, the thinking is done, the organization is there, the civil society structures are there, and then it happens. So I think we can look to a whole range of different historical and current examples and learn from them. That's the best I can offer. But it's a complex, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And linked to this, I think we've got time for one last question, if that's okay. Linked to that, understanding the context of different countries, are there a sense of possible common approach? I think you touched on those elements there.
I think so. I think what would be, as I say, economic insecurity doesn't lend itself to very simple metrics. It has indicators. I don't, you know, you can get into the world of dashboards and so on and so forth. But I think almost what it requires is, I mean, and I think the UN is critical in this, establishing its importance, why it matters, but then two, designing a sort of diagnostic tools that can enable civil society organizations, governments, researchers in higher education and beyond to understand where a country is, what the blockages are, what the drivers are, what the risks are. So you can then think about where are we across a range of these different areas, and see a whole picture and think about then what needs to adjust, what needs to be changed, is it policy, regulation, so on and so forth. And you know, if you're able to do that, you can start to create a picture. It doesn't sort of distill down into a nice graph or table, but it does help describe where you are. And once you understand that, you can think about what the most logical steps forward are and learn from others in the process of doing so. So I think actually that sort of that global framework and diagnostic, as well as that intensity of relevance and necessity, I think in and of themselves are extraordinarily helpful.
Sure. And yeah, very helpful for us at the UN. Thanks, Anthony. So I think that takes us to our hour. So I don't want to, I mean, I know people have their responsibilities to get back to. So if that's okay with you, Anthony, I'll close it there.
Yeah.
Just want to say thank you again for the excellent presentation and then a really rich question and answer session. Obviously it was just the two of us speaking, but we had a voice from all of our attendees. So thanks to everybody for attending, and thanks for all the questions. And the recording of this, it's been available live on Facebook, but it will also be available on our divisional website at desa.org/DISD. And we'd love to continue the conversation with Anthony as we work on economic insecurity. Thanks again, Anthony.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for the great questions and comments. Really appreciated all of it.
Great. Thanks, everybody.